The call I got from the hospital wasn't the one I expected on the worst night of my life. I was 3 days postpartum. 3 days. My son Eli was still in the NICU because he came 6 weeks early and his lungs weren't quite ready for the world yet. I hadn't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch. My body felt like it had been turned inside out. I was running on cold coffee, adrenaline, and the kind of desperate love that only a new mother understands. And my husband Marcus was driving home from picking up things we forgot, the specific nipple cream the lactation consultant recommended, the brand of pacifier they said Eli preferred, a change of clothes for me because I'd been wearing the same hospital gown for 2 days straight. He never made it back. A drunk driver ran a red light at 11:17 on a Tuesday night and hit Marcus's car on the driver's side going 50 miles an hour in a 30 zone. I found out because a nurse came into my room with the softest expression on her face, the kind that medical professionals practice in training because it means something catastrophic is about to come out of their mouth. She told me Marcus had been brought into the same hospital. She told me he was in surgery. She told me I needed to call someone. The first person I called was my mother. And what she said to me in that moment, what she actually said, and then what she did in the hours that followed, changed every single thing about the life I thought I had. But I need to back up. Because you won't understand how deep this goes unless you understand where I come from. My name is Claire. I grew up in a house where love was conditional and the conditions were always changing. My parents, Gerald and Donna Whitmore, built a modest but comfortable life in suburban Ohio. My dad worked in insurance. My mother volunteered at the church and kept the house spotless and spent enormous amounts of energy managing how the family looked to other people. I have one brother, Derek, who is 4 years older than me and has been my parents' entire world since the day he was born. I am not exaggerating that. Derek was the athlete, the charmer, the one who walked into rooms and made people laugh. He was handsome and sociable, and he had a talent for making my parents feel like they had succeeded at something. When Derek won a trophy, my mother would hang it in the living room. When I won an academic award, and I won several, she would say, "That's nice, honey," and put it in my room. I learned early that I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need as much attention because I wasn't causing any problems. I got straight A's not because anyone pushed me, but because education felt like the one thing that was fully mine. I got a scholarship to a state university. I studied accounting. I graduated early with honors. My parents came to my graduation. My mother spent most of the reception asking other parents about their kids. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because the dynamic I grew up in, the way I was trained to shrink myself, to expect less, to not make a fuss, that dynamic is exactly what my parents tried to use against me when everything fell apart. What they didn't know is that I had spent the last 4 years quietly building something they didn't know existed. But we'll get there. I met Marcus at work. I was 26, 3 years into my accounting job at a mid-sized firm, and he came in as a new hire in the operations department. He was steady and kind and laughed at my dry humor in a way that made me feel seen. We dated for 2 years. Got engaged, got married in a small ceremony that my mother complained was not memorable enough, and moved into a house in a neighborhood 30 minutes from my parents. My parents tolerated Marcus. That's the most accurate word. He wasn't from a family they could brag about. His parents were working class, his dad a mechanic, his mom a school cafeteria worker. They were warm and generous, and I loved them immediately. My parents were polite to them at family events in the way that people are polite to service workers, technically correct, completely dismissive. Derek, meanwhile, was living the life my parents had always imagined for him. He'd married a woman named Sasha, whose family had money, and they lived in a big house 20 minutes from my parents, and Sunday dinners happened at Derek and Sasha's place or at my parents' house, and I was invited sometimes. And sometimes I found out about them after the fact when my mother would mention in passing that we all had a wonderful time. We all. Not including me, apparently. When I got pregnant, my mother's first response was to ask whether we had planned it. My father's first response was to ask if Marcus's job was stable. Derek called 3 days later with a perfunctory congratulations that lasted 90 seconds before he turned the conversation to something about his own life. Marcus's parents called immediately, cried, offered to help with anything we needed, drove 3 hours to take us to dinner. I noted the difference. I didn't say anything. Eli came early because I had a condition called preeclampsia that nobody caught until it became an emergency. One afternoon at 34 weeks, I had a headache that I can only describe as my skull trying to escape my body. My vision went weird, and Marcus drove me to the hospital where my blood pressure was high enough that 3 nurses exchanged looks over my head. They delivered Eli by emergency C-section 4 hours later. He was 4 pounds, 11 ounces. He was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my entire life. He went straight to the NICU. I couldn't hold him for 18 hours. Those 18 hours were the longest of my existence. I lay in a hospital bed with a fresh surgical incision and empty arms, and Marcus held my hand, and we both pretended we weren't terrified. My parents came to the hospital the next day. They looked at Eli through the NICU glass. My mother said he was so tiny, in a voice that suggested this was a personal inconvenience. My father asked when he'd be able to go home. They stayed for 45 minutes and left because my mother said the hospital smell was giving her a headache. Marcus's parents stayed for 6 hours. His mother brought food. His father sat with Marcus in the hallway and talked about nothing in particular in that way that fathers do when they're trying to hold their sons together. 3 days later, Marcus went to get supplies. 3 days later, the drunk driver. 3 days later, the nurse with the soft expression. And I called my mother. Mom. My voice didn't sound like my voice. It sounded like a voice coming from somewhere underneath the floor. Marcus was in an accident. He's in surgery here at the hospital. I need you to come. There was a pause. Tonight? Yes, tonight. Mom, he might. I stopped. I couldn't finish the sentence. I'm alone here. Eli is in the NICU. I just had a C-section 3 days ago. I need someone here. Another pause. I heard her cover the phone and say something to my father that I couldn't make out. Claire, honey, your father and I just got settled in for the evening. Derek and Sasha are here. We were about to have dessert. Mom, can't you call one of your friends? What about that woman from your office? I want you to sit with that for a moment. My husband was in emergency surgery. My premature baby was in the NICU. I was 3 days post-C-section, alone in a hospital room, asking my mother to come be with me. And her first instinct was to suggest I call someone from my office. I need my family, I said, very quietly. Please come. There was a long pause and some more muffled conversation, and then she came back and said they'd see how Derek and Sasha felt about wrapping up, and maybe they could come in the morning. In the morning? I don't remember exactly what I said next. I think I said okay. I think I said goodnight. I think I hung up the phone and sat in the hospital bed for about 10 minutes not feeling anything at all, and then I called Marcus's parents, who got in their car and started driving 3 hours in the dark without a single moment of hesitation. His mother Sandra was holding my hand by 2 in the morning. My parents arrived the next afternoon. Marcus survived. I need you to know that. I need to tell you that right now because I don't want you carrying that fear through this story. He survived, but it was not simple, and it was not quick, and the road in between was one of the hardest things I have ever watched someone I love endure. He had a broken left arm, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a traumatic brain injury that the doctors described as moderate in a way that made it clear the word moderate was doing a lot of heavy lifting. He was unconscious for the first 4 days. The doctors told me there would be a long recovery. Months, possibly longer. I sat with Marcus in the ICU when they let me. I sat with Eli in the NICU when I could walk the distance. I sat alone in my hospital room in between and tried to figure out how a person holds this much at once. My parents showed up the following afternoon, as promised. They came to the ICU waiting room. They asked the nurse a few questions. They looked at Marcus through the glass in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of how they'd looked at Eli through the NICU glass, like he was something difficult they were being asked to assess. My mother said it was all very serious. My father said he hoped the other driver had good insurance. Then my mother said something that I keep coming back to, even now, even years later. She said, "You know, Claire, this is going to be very hard. You have a premature baby and now a husband who may not recover fully, and you're in no condition to manage any of it on your own. Have you thought about what you're going to do?" I asked her what she meant. She said, "Well, you're going to need help. And I don't know that Marcus's parents are really equipped to provide the kind of support structure you need. Your father and I have been talking, and we think it might make more sense for you to come stay with us. Bring the baby when he's released. We have more space. We're more stable. Sandra and Robert are already planning to stay, I said. They're at a hotel down the street. My mother's expression did a thing. It shifted in a way I had seen my whole life, but could never quite name, something between offense and recalibration. Like she had expected to be needed and discovered she wasn't, and was deciding how to feel about that. Well, she said, I just think family should be there for family. I almost said it. I almost said what we were all thinking. But I had spent 30 years learning to swallow things, and I swallowed it again. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone yet, was that two things had happened in the previous year that changed the entire architecture of my family situation. Two things that I had kept private, for very deliberate reasons. Two things that my parents, if they had known about them, would have completely changed how they treated me. The first thing was money. The second thing was my grandfather. I need to tell you about Grandpa Walt. Walter Whitmore was my father's father, and he was the opposite of my father in almost every way. Where my father was careful and image-conscious and emotionally withholding, Grandpa Walt was big and loud and completely indifferent to appearances. He'd built a small contracting business from nothing, worked with his hands his whole life, and had the kind of values that don't come from church attendance but from actually living them out. He loved me in a way that my parents never quite managed. I don't think they even noticed. When I was small, Grandpa Walt was the one who asked about my grades, not to compare them to Derek's, but because he was genuinely proud. He came to my science fair project the year I built a model of the water cycle and won second place, and he stood there with his big hands on his hips and said, "My Claire figured that out herself," to anyone who would listen. When I went to college, he called me every Sunday. When I got married, he danced with me at the reception and told me that Marcus was a good man and that good men were worth keeping. What I didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Grandpa Walt had been watching the family dynamics for decades with a lot more clarity than anyone gave him credit for. And about 2 years before all of this, when he was 79 and starting to feel the weight of his age, he'd made some decisions. Quiet ones. Legal ones. I found out about them because he told me himself, on a Sunday phone call about 14 months before Marcus's accident.
Claire, he said,
I want you to know I've made arrangements. I've talked to a lawyer. I don't want you to say anything to your parents or your brother, because it'll just cause a fuss, and I've had enough fussing in my life. I asked him what kind of arrangements.
He told me.
I sat in the parking lot of a grocery store for 25 minutes after we hung up, completely still, understanding for the first time that my grandfather had seen everything and had decided, in his quiet and methodical way, to do something about it. Grandpa Walt had a property. A commercial property. A small strip of retail space in a town about an hour away that he'd owned outright since the 1980s and that had been generating rental income for 40 years. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something my parents ever talked about. As far as I could tell, they assumed it would eventually just become part of whatever estate he left behind, split among family. What they didn't know was that 18 months before our phone call, Grandpa Walt had transferred the title.
To me.
Just me. Not my father. Not Derek. Not anyone else. He transferred the property into my name through a proper legal process with a real estate attorney, paid the gift taxes himself so there'd be no complications, and given me a separate account that contained 4 years of rental income he'd been quietly saving for the right time. I've watched your brother get everything handed to him his whole life, he told me on that phone call. And I've watched you earn everything you have and never complain about the difference. I'm too old to fix what your parents did wrong. But I can do this. This is yours. Don't tell anyone until you know what you want to do with it. I sat with that information for over a year. I didn't touch the property. I didn't spend the money. I hired an accountant I trusted completely, not from my own firm, from a separate office across town, to manage the rental income quietly and keep the records clean. I was waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for. It turned out I was waiting for the moment when my family showed me exactly who they were. Marcus was in the hospital for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, a pattern emerged so clearly that I would have laughed if I hadn't been so exhausted. Sandra and Robert, Marcus's parents, were there every single day. Sandra brought food for the nurses. Robert fixed a loose bracket on Marcus's forestand without being asked because he noticed it wobbling and it bothered him. They took turns sitting with Eli in the NICU so I could be with Marcus. They learned the names of every doctor and nurse involved in both cases. They slept in terrible hotel beds and didn't complain once. My parents visited 4 times in 3 weeks. 4 times. The second visit, my mother brought a casserole that she mentioned making 3 separate times in a single conversation. The third visit, my father spent most of the time on his phone in the waiting room. The fourth visit, they brought Derek and Sasha. Derek shook my hand. He actually shook my hand. I was standing in a hospital hallway 3 weeks after nearly losing my husband and my son simultaneously, and my brother walked up and shook my hand like we were acquaintances at a networking event. Sasha gave me a look of practiced sympathy and said she couldn't imagine how hard this must be while standing in a way that suggested she was being very generous with her time. You know, Derek said at one point, while we were all sitting in the ICU waiting room and Marcus was in physical therapy, "You're going to need to figure out the financial situation pretty soon. I mean, Marcus isn't going to be working for a while, right?
And you just had a baby."
And that house. What about the house? I said. Well, I just mean it's a lot to maintain. Do you have enough saved to cover the mortgage if Marcus is out for months? I watched him very carefully. The way he asked it, the slight lean forward, the way his eyes moved to my mother, who looked away. We're fine, Derek, I said. Because if you needed help, I'm sure Dad could. We're fine. And we were. Not because Marcus had been working, and not because my salary alone was enormous, but because of something else I hadn't told anyone yet. The second thing. The thing I mentioned earlier. About a year before the accident, I had made a decision with the rental income from the property. I had used a portion of it as a down payment on a quiet investment, a short-term rental property that Marcus and I had bought through an LLC I'd set up with the guidance of the accountant and a business attorney. We had kept it separate from our personal finances. Marcus knew about it. His parents knew about it. Nobody else did. Between the rental income from Grandpa Walt's property and the income from our own short-term rental, I had a financial cushion that meant Marcus being out of work for a year would not threaten our home, our stability, or Eli's care. I had not told my parents this because I had learned something important about people like my parents. They are only generous when they believe you have nothing. The moment they know you have something, they find ways to need it. I waited. I watched. And I started keeping notes. Eli came home after 22 days in the NICU. He weighed 5 pounds, 8 ounces. He was the size of a sweet potato, and he was the loudest, angriest, most magnificently alive little creature I had ever encountered. Marcus came home a week later, thinner and slower, and with a brace on his arm and a list of follow-up appointments that took up an entire page. His memory had gaps. His headaches were frequent. His doctors were cautiously optimistic in the way that medical professionals are when they're being honest about uncertainty. Sandra stayed with us for the first 6 weeks. She slept on the pull-out couch and got up with Eli at 2 in the morning and 3:30 in the morning and 5 in the morning, so I could sleep between feedings. She made soup. She did laundry without being asked. She sat with Marcus for hours and watched old westerns with him because it was the kind of content his healing brain could follow without strain. My mother called twice a week and asked how things were going in a way that suggested she expected the answer to be fine. One afternoon she called and asked whether I'd thought more about arrangements, and I asked what kind of arrangements, and she said, "Well, you have so much on your plate. We were thinking maybe Eli could come stay with us for a few weeks so you can focus on Marcus." "Sandra is here," I said. "I know, but we're his grandparents too, Claire. We'd like to be involved. You're welcome to visit anytime." There was a pause that communicated dissatisfaction without saying anything I could directly address. It was a skill my mother had perfected over 50 years. "Your father, and I just worry," she said. "I know," I said. "Derek says you seemed stressed when he called." Derek had not called. Derek had texted me 2 weeks earlier with a thumbs-up emoji in response to my message about Eli coming home, and I had not heard from him since. "I'm doing okay," I said.
"Well,
"We're here if you need us." They weren't. But I said thank you and got off the phone and wrote the date and a summary of the conversation in the document I had been keeping since Marcus's accident night. The document with the dates and the times and the quotes and the records. I had a feeling I was going to need it. For months after the accident, Marcus was doing better. Not fully, not quickly, but genuinely better. He was back to working part-time from home. His headaches were less frequent. He was reading again, which had been hard for a while and whose recovery made him happier than almost anything else. Eli was thriving. He was catching up on his developmental milestones at a rate that made his pediatrician use the word impressive more than once. He had Marcus's eyes and my stubbornness and an opinion about every single thing in his environment. Life was stabilizing. And then my grandfather got sick. Grandpa Walt had been declining for about a year. His heart, his knees, the general accumulation of 80 years lived hard and well. He was still sharp. Still called me on Sundays. But the calls were shorter, and sometimes he got tired in the middle of a story. In the spring, he was hospitalized with congestive heart failure. My parents descended on the hospital like they had been waiting for this exact event. My mother rearranged her entire schedule. My father took time off work. Derek and Sasha visited 4 times in 5 days. The family gathered in waiting rooms and spoke in serious voices about Grandpa Walt's prognosis and his affairs and what needed to be handled. I came as often as I could with a 4-month-old and a husband still in recovery, which was not as often as I would have liked, and my mother made sure I knew she noticed. "It would be nice if you could be here more," she said at one point, in front of Derek and my father and 2 of my aunts. "I have a baby," I said. "And Marcus is still recovering. Sandra is with Marcus, isn't she? I'm sure she could manage Eli for a few hours." "Sandra has her own life, Mom. She's been here for 4 months. Well, that word again, used as a sentence. Family comes first. I looked at her. I thought about the night I called from the hospital. I thought about dessert time. I thought about the morning. I didn't say anything. Grandpa Walt was in the hospital for 10 days and then came home to a care facility where he was comfortable and receiving good attention. He asked to see me specifically, alone, about a week after he was settled. I left Eli with Marcus and drove an hour to sit with my grandfather in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and had a view of a parking lot, and he held my hand with his big rough fingers and looked at me with the sharp eyes that had always seen more than people expected. "They don't know, do they?" he said. "No," I said. "You told me not to tell anyone." He nodded slowly. "Good. There's something else you need to know." He reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out an envelope, thick with paper, which he handed to me. "My will. The lawyer has a copy. But I wanted you to have one too, so there are no surprises. Read it when you get home. Don't read it here." I took the envelope. I didn't read it until I was in my car, which I know is not what he said, but my curiosity lasted approximately 45 seconds past the parking lot. I sat in the front seat of my car in the parking lot of my grandfather's care facility and read his will. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. Not from grief. From something else entirely. I'm not going to tell you everything that was in that will right now because you need to understand the sequence of events in order to understand why it mattered. What I will tell you is that my grandfather had been very precise, very specific, and very thorough. He had worked with his attorney for over 2 years on this document. He had made choices that would have consequences for every person in my family, and those consequences were directly tied to the way those people had behaved over the course of his observation. He had been watching all of us for a long time, and he had written it all down. I drove home. I hugged Marcus. I held Eli longer than I usually did at bedtime. And then I called the attorney whose name was on the letterhead of the will, a woman named Patricia Moss, and I made an appointment. What I found out at that appointment sent me back to my notes document to add 3 more pages. Patricia Moss had the calm competence of someone who had spent 30 years watching families tear each other apart over money and had developed the ability to exist in the middle of that without taking on the damage. She was thorough and she was careful and she confirmed everything in the will. She also told me something my grandfather had not fully explained on the phone call a year earlier. The commercial property he had transferred to me was not the only asset he had moved. In the years before his death, and he had been planning this for longer than anyone knew, He had restructured his holdings in specific ways. His primary residence, which everyone assumed would go to my father as the eldest child, had been put into a trust. The trust had specific conditions. The conditions related to behavior. Specifically to the behavior my grandfather had documented, in writing, with dates, regarding how his grandchildren had been treated and supported by their parents. Patricia Moss slid a folder across the desk to me. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather, dated about 18 months before the accident, paper-clipped to a series of notes in his handwriting.
Dates.
Events. Observations. The night Marcus was in surgery and my parents stayed home for dessert was there. The 4 hospital visits in 3 weeks were there. The casserole mentioned 3 times. The handshake. He had been talking to Sandra. Grandpa Walt had been talking to Marcus's mother for years. They had met at my wedding and discovered a shared directness and a shared irritation at people who talked about family while failing to show up for it. Sandra had mentioned things, not as gossip, not to cause trouble, but in the honest conversations of people who actually cared about someone. My grandfather had written it all down. And the conditions of his trust were, in the plainest language I had ever seen in a legal document, that his estate assets would pass to those who had shown by their actions, rather than their words, a genuine commitment to the well-being of the family's most vulnerable members in their times of greatest need. Patricia Moss let me read the whole thing before she said anything else. Then she folded her hands and said, "Your grandfather was a very methodical man." "He really was," I said. "There will be a reading of the will when the time comes. I would encourage you to attend. I'll be there. You should also know," she said carefully, "that your grandfather asked me to retain documentation independent of what you have. In the event of any challenge to the will, there is a substantial record." I thought about Derek. I thought about my mother's face. I thought about the morning. "Let them challenge it," I said. Grandpa Walt died on a Tuesday evening in August. He was 80 years old, and he was comfortable, and he had asked for the window to be left open because he liked the sound of whatever birds came to the care facility garden. His last Sunday call to me was 9 days before he died. He told me about the birds. He said he was glad I was doing okay. He said he was proud of me. I was in the parking lot of a grocery store again when he died, which felt like either a coincidence or the universe's sense of humor. I sat there for a while before I drove home. The family gathered quickly. Death does that. It collapses distances that seemed permanent, pulls people into the same rooms who have been avoiding each other, creates urgency out of geography. My parents organized. My mother, specifically, organized in the way she organized everything, visibly, loudly, with a constant undercurrent of performance. She arranged the flowers. She coordinated the reception after the funeral. She sent emails to relatives with the schedule and parking information as if she were running a corporate event. She spoke about Grandpa Walt in the past tense with a fluency that surprised me because I had the sense she was already thinking past the grief to the practical matters. Derek was similarly focused. He cornered my father at least twice that I saw to have quiet conversations that stopped when I came into range. He clapped my father on the shoulder in the church parking lot and said something about making sure everything goes smoothly. I watched all of this and said nothing. I had spoken to Patricia Moss the day before the funeral. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at her office, with all named parties in attendance. She had notified everyone involved. 6 days to wait. I spent those 6 days the way I had spent the previous year, being present with Marcus and Eli, managing what needed to be managed, adding to my notes when something notable happened, and not saying a word about anything I knew. My mother, in those 6 days, called me 3 times. Each call had the same architecture, a few minutes of genuine grief that faded quickly into something that felt more like calculation. On the 3rd call, she mentioned that Grandpa Walt's house was so beautifully maintained and that she hoped things would be settled simply. On the 2nd call, she mentioned that Derek had been so devoted to Grandpa Walt in his final months. On the 1st call, she mentioned that it would make sense for the property to stay in the immediate family. I said in the right places and kept my voice neutral. On Thursday evening, the night before the reading, Derek called me directly, which was unusual enough that I noted the time. Just wanted to touch base, he said. About tomorrow.
Sure, I said.
I know these things can be emotional. I just want to make sure we all go in with the right mindset. Grandpa would have wanted things to be peaceful. I know you've had a hard year, and I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, the family will make sure you're taken care of. I let that sit for a moment. The patronizing architecture of it. The assumption. The offer of charity wrapped in the language of family. That's thoughtful, I said. I just mean, whatever he left. We'll make sure it's handled fairly. I'll see you tomorrow, Derek. Patricia Moss's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. Conference room. Long table. Water pitchers. The kind of quiet that accumulates in rooms where serious things happen. My parents arrived looking composed. Derek and Sasha arrived looking confident. 2 of my father's siblings came, Aunt Rosemary and Uncle Phil, along with their adult children, who were various levels of uncomfortable about being there. I arrived with Marcus, who was walking steadily now and had left his arm brace behind 2 months earlier. We sat at one end of the table. Marcus held my hand under the table where nobody could see. Patricia Moss began. She was efficient and clear, and she read the will in a voice that gave nothing away. The personal bequests came first. Furniture to specific relatives. His watch collection, which was extensive, allocated with specific names. A cash gift to his longtime neighbor who had brought him soup every winter for 20 years. His tools, all of them, to Marcus's father Robert, because Robert is the kind of man who knows what to do with good tools and will use them right.
My father made a small movement at that.
Just a small one. Patricia Moss continued. The care facility costs had been covered by a specific account set aside for that purpose. No estate impact. His car to Aunt Rosemary, who had visited weekly for years without being asked. And then we got to the real property. Patricia Moss looked up briefly before she read this section. Just briefly. Regarding the primary residence and associated land, she said, and the financial accounts not previously allocated, these assets shall pass to my granddaughter Claire, in recognition of her consistent demonstration of integrity, quiet perseverance, and genuine care for those who depend on her, as observed and documented over many years. It is my belief that Claire understands the value of things that cannot be easily seen, and that she will steward what I leave her with the same patience and good sense she has shown in all things. The room was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then my mother said, "I'm sorry, can you read that again?" Patricia Moss read it again. Derek's face had gone a very specific shade that I can only describe as the color of someone who has just realized a game they thought they were winning had been played by entirely different rules. "There must be a mistake," my father said. His voice was controlled, but just barely. "Claire, what did you know about this?" Before I could answer, Patricia Moss said, "Mr. Whitmore, there is no mistake. This document was prepared over a period of 2 years, with full legal competency documented at each stage. Your father was very deliberate." "I'd like to contest this," Derek said. He said it quickly, like he'd had it ready. Patricia Moss nodded calmly. "You are entitled to do that. I should mention that your grandfather anticipated that possibility and has left a supplementary record with this office, a detailed personal account of his observations and reasoning, spanning approximately 40 pages, which would become relevant in any contest proceeding." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. 40 pages, my mother said. "Approximately," said Patricia Moss. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table. "This is unbelievable," Sasha said, which was the first thing she had said the entire meeting, and it wasn't clear if she meant the situation or the amount or both. "He was 80 years old," Derek said. "How do we know he was?" "I have documentation of 5 separate competency assessments conducted by his physician over the past 3 years, Patricia Moss said. "Requested by Mr. Whitmore himself, in anticipation of exactly this question." Derek looked at my father. My father looked at the table.
My mother looked at me.
I want to be honest about this moment. I had imagined it. I had sat with Marcus on evenings when Eli was asleep and described the scene in this room and what I thought it would feel like. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought I would feel something large and bright. What I actually felt was very quiet. A kind of settling. Like something that had been tilted for 30 years had finally come level. "I want to say something," I said.
Everyone looked at me.
Grandpa Walt made his own choices. I didn't ask him for any of this, and I didn't know about the full extent of it until recently. If anyone wants to have a real conversation about any of this, I'm open to that. I paused. But I want to be clear about something. The night Marcus was in surgery and Eli was in the NICU, I called Mom, and she suggested I find someone from the office to call. Marcus's parents drove 3 hours in the middle of the night. That's in Grandpa's notes. Because Sandra told him. Because she was there. My mother's face did the thing again. The shifting. The recalibration. And over the past 8 months, I continued. Marcus's parents have given us more real support than I can calculate. My parents visited 4 times while Marcus was in the hospital. I counted. 4 times in 3 weeks. I kept my voice even. Grandpa Walt counted too. He wrote it down. The room was very still. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone," I said. "I'm doing this because I think it's important that we're honest about what happened. And about why Grandpa made the choices he made." My father looked like he was trying to locate something to say and couldn't find it. Derek said, "You could have said something. You could have told us things were hard."
"I did," I said.
"I called Mom from the hospital at 11:30 at night. I said I needed family. She said she'd see how dessert went." Nobody contested that. Patricia Moss let the silence run for a moment and then very professionally moved the meeting to its conclusion. What happened after was not clean or simple. Real life rarely is. Derek did consult a separate attorney about contesting the will. That attorney, after reviewing Patricia Moss's documentation, all 40 pages of it, plus the legal history of the competency assessments, plus the meticulous paper trail Grandpa Walt had built over years, advised him that a contest would be expensive, time-consuming, and extremely unlikely to succeed. Derek did not pursue it. My parents did not speak to me for about 2 months. Then my mother called, and the call was different from the others, quieter, less performance in it, more of the thing underneath. She didn't apologize exactly. She got close to it. She said she knew things had been uneven over the years. She said she hadn't realized how much the night of the accident had affected me. She said she wanted things to be better. I told her I wanted that too. I meant it. I didn't forget anything, but I meant it. My father came to Eli's first birthday. He held Eli for a long time, and I watched my father's face do something it didn't usually do, soften in a way that wasn't about performance, that was just about a small person who didn't know anything yet about family dynamics and inheritance and dessert timing, who just grabbed my father's finger and held on. "We're not fixed."
"I want to be honest about that."
"You don't fix 30 years in a birthday moment. But we're trying, and trying is something. Derek is harder. Derek has a pride that goes very deep, and the will reading cracked something in his understanding of himself that hasn't fully healed. He's polite when we see each other. He asks about Marcus and Eli with what seems like genuine interest. But there's a distance that wasn't there before, or maybe that was always there, and we're both just being honest about it now. Sasha sends Eli birthday cards. I appreciate that. The commercial property is still generating income. We brought a property management company in to handle it professionally, and the numbers are clean and consistent. Marcus knows about all of it now, every detail, and we've made decisions together about what to do with what Grandpa Walt left us. We're building something. Quietly, carefully, the way I've always done things. Sandra and Robert come for holidays and some weekends. Sandra taught me how to make the soup she brought to the hospital the night Marcus was in surgery, and I make it every winter, and I think about that night, and about what it means to show up. Marcus is better. Not all the way. There are still hard days, still moments when the brain injury makes itself known in unexpected ways, still medical appointments that we handle together. But he's working full-time now. He coaches a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings. He reads voraciously, which after the months when reading was hard for him is something neither of us takes for granted. Eli is 3. He is absolutely certain he is the most important person in any room he enters, and he may be right. I still have the notes document. All of it. The dates, the times, the conversations, the 4 hospital visits, the morning, all of it. I haven't deleted it. I don't think I will. Not because I need it anymore, but because it's a record of something important. A record of what I learned about showing up versus talking about showing up. A record of what my grandfather saw clearly when everyone else was too busy performing family to actually be one. A record of what Sandra knew without being told and what Marcus's father understood without having to be asked. I keep it because I want Eli to understand someday when he's old enough that the most important things in a life are not the loudest things. That love is not a word you say at holidays. That presence, real, inconvenient, 3 hours in the dark presence, is the thing that tells the truth about who you are. Grandpa Walt knew that. He'd known it for 80 years, and he wrote it down so nobody could argue with it. The last thing he said to me on our last phone call was not dramatic. He didn't know it was the last one, and neither did I. He said the birds at the care facility were particularly loud that morning, and he'd asked a nurse what kind they were, and she'd looked it up on her phone and told him they were house sparrows, and he'd said that was funny because he'd always assumed sparrows were quiet birds, but it turned out they were actually one of the louder species once you started listening. Most things are louder than you'd expect, he said, once you start paying attention. I've been paying attention ever since. And what I've found, in the years since that night in a hospital parking lot when my hands were shaking over a will that told me my grandfather had seen me, really seen me, is that the life I was quietly building while everyone else was performing theirs turned out to be more solid than anything they were showing off. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to matter most to it. You just have to show up.